Good afternoon. My name is Gujari Singh. I'm from the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Thank you all for coming and for those joining us online. Before we get started with the panel, we would like to take a moment of silence for the victims of the shootings in Pittsburgh and Kentucky. Our thoughts and prayers are with those affected. I would like to now introduce Asma Uddin, the Senior Scholar and Faculty of the Religious Freedom Center.
Good afternoon. My name is Asma Uddin, and I am Senior Scholar and Faculty here at the Religious Freedom Center. On behalf of the RFC, I extend a warm welcome to our distinguished guests and panelists, and a special welcome to our audience who is watching the live stream broadcast of this event. Thank you also to our event partner, the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund, the nation's oldest Sikh American civil rights, media, and education organization. The mission of the Religious Freedom Center is twofold: to educate the public about the history, meaning, and significance of religious freedom, and to promote dialogue and understanding among people of all religions and none. Our mission is of central importance in today's polarized climate where religion is so deeply misunderstood and where the role of religion in public discourse has become increasingly contentious. Joyce, Richard, Rose, Jerry, Cecil, David, Bernice, Sylvan, Daniel, Melvin, Irving. These are the names of the 11 Jewish worshipers who were gunned down 2 days ago in what's been called the deadliest attack against Jewish people in US history. The gunmen had a history of displaying white supremacist hate online, slamming the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society for simply helping refugees in need, and spewing anger towards Jewish people and Muslim people. Maurice, Vicky. These are the names of the Black man and Black woman gunned down by a white supremacist on Wednesday at a Kentucky supermarket. The gunman first tried to shoot up a nearby Black church, but found the doors locked. Maurice was with his 12-year-old grandson buying poster board for a school project when he was fatally shot. Just days earlier, a self-described white supremacist sent 14 bombs to 12 current and former public officials. The bomber, who drove a van with pictures of Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and Van Jones of CNN with crosshairs over them, had also posted anti-Muslim memes in the past. This was 1 week in the United States. 11 Jewish community leaders have issued an open letter saying that Donald Trump is not welcome in Pittsburgh until he decides to fully denounce white nationalism. The leaders are all affiliated with the Pittsburgh branch of Bend the Ark, a Jewish partnership. And Ariel Gingold from Bend the Ark is with us today. Their letter reads, "For the past 3 years, your words and your policies have emboldened a growing white nationalist movement. You yourself call the murder evil, but yesterday's violence is a direct culmination of your influence." That rhetoric most recently included a statement at an October 23rd rally where President Trump said, "A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that." You know, they have a word, it's sort of become old-fashioned, it's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. Nothing wrong, use that word, use that word. President Trump's statement ignited a conversation on the meaning of nationalist and the message he was sending when he identified as one. The president said the term just reflected his belief in America first. Our country has taken second fiddle, he said, and that needs to change. Critics, however, described it as an example of dog whistle politics, the use of a term that might not overtly raise alarms, but does generate the desired emotional and behavioral response in all those in range. As one commentator wrote, Americans who have long been fed a diet of coded racism are prepared to hear Trump's comments for what they are, a defense of us, of white Americans against others whose perceived free ride in the back of taxpayers is now ending. Yet it has allowed them to avoid admitting to themselves that this is the specific message received. At the same time, the racist subtext of this message is clear and is heard quite clearly by those who are attuned to its frequency. This is why the neo-Nazi outlet, the Daily Stormer, wrote afterwards in celebration, gleefully claiming that President Trump is our guy. Another response to the president's statement was by the Pluralism Project, which noted that America is, quote, not a nation state. Instead, we are a people of many races, nations, and tribes who by no small measure have come together to know and understand one another and form something great, end quote. Who are we as a people, as a country? How are Americans talking about these issues, and how does religion figure into these discussions? This past summer, several events ignited the conversation over and over again. We started off the summer with 2 Supreme Court decisions. One was Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado Civil Rights Commission. And then 3 weeks later, the court decided the travel ban case. In the first case, 7 justices rebuked the Colorado Commission for its overt hostility to religion. In this case, the Christian religion of the baker who refused to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. In the second case, the court gave the president extreme deference and upheld the travel ban despite replete evidence of religious animus against Muslims. Many Americans saw this very different approach to animus as just more evidence that in America, not all religions are equal. A month later, the Department of Justice held its Religious Liberty Summit, during which Attorney General Jeff Sessions introduced the Religious Liberty Task Force. The task force will be enforcing the Department of Justice's broad religious liberty guidance. Within 24 hours, nearly every media outlet in America covered Sessions' remarks. Many of these pieces worried that the task force was designed simply to protect conservative Christian claims and not others, and that many of those claims were about pushing back against gay rights. Finally, we are just days away from the midterm elections. Religion has played a significant role in these elections. One Muslim advocacy firm issued a report last week titled Running on Hate, which outlines the candidates that have made anti-Muslim rhetoric a key part of their campaign strategy. With us to discuss these and many other issues related to religion and the national discourse is our distinguished panel. The panel will be moderated by Gavneet Singh. Mr. Singh serves as a board chair for SALDEF. He works for a national healthcare organization where his leadership responsibilities relate to performance management and strategy execution. And he's brought these skills to SALDEF when he advises on strategy, and he's also advised SALDEF's interactive curriculum, Sikhism for 101 for law enforcement. And he's assisted in training local, state, and federal law enforcement officials about awareness and protocol and addressing audiences about Sikhism, the Sikh American community, civil rights, and diversity in our regional and national forums. Singh has been quoted in publications including CNN, NBC, and Huffington Post, and has appeared on local, national, and international broadcast and radio interviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Also, on behalf of SALDEF, my sincere thanks to the museum and to the Religious Freedom Center for putting together this, what we hope to be a wonderful event, and particularly to these 6 distinguished panelists that I have the good fortune of keeping in line a little bit today, I think. Before I begin, a quick introduction about the organization that I'm fortunate to represent. SALDEF is the Sikh American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Founded in '96, the nation's oldest Sikh American civil rights, education, and media organization. Our mission is to empower Sikh Americans by building dialogue, deepening understanding, promoting civic and political participation, and upholding social justice and religious freedom for all Americans. So as you can see, something very much in our bailiwick, and that we're excited to start this conversation about how can you disagree but also be productive together? How can we have multiple viewpoints on a similar topic, but actually agree to disagree and work to move forward as a small community, as a state, as a locality, and eventually as a country. As I was putting together my comments, I think it's poignant just to remember, and Asma said it beautifully, but I'll just reinforce, a tough week for our country. Not just the tragic loss of 11 lives in Pittsburgh over the weekend, and the half dozen or so injured, but the 2 murders in Kentucky of our African-American brother and sister there were killed in this senseless violence. And then not to mention the pipe bombs that were mailed out, almost 15 across the country. At a time leading up to an election, you would think this would be an opportunity to bring the country together, an opportunity to have people have honest discussions, to talk about where we want to go, what's the future that we see. Yet we see this continued divisive and hateful rhetoric and these heinous and unforgivable acts being perpetrated. I'm excited that this panel here, a diverse group of folks from different faiths, different backgrounds, and different political affiliations, are here to share their thoughts about how them being here and representing the political diversity, the religious diversity that we have in our country, and to show how we can come together and actually have conversations. A number of things we'll touch on today: the Masterpiece Cake Shop verdict, how this political rhetoric is affecting our country, right? At a micro level, what are we seeing? What's the appropriateness of religion in the public sphere even? Many would argue that there is no such place. So how do we rationalize that? And then how are the changing religious demographics together, or bringing together diversity that our country represents to engage in a thoughtful, respectful conversation? With that, I will introduce our panelists. So first, I'll start with Melissa Rogers, who's a non-resident senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute. She served as a special assistant to the president and executive director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships during the Obama administration. Melissa previously served as a chair of the inaugural Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Prior to that, she was the director of the Center for Religious and Public Affairs at Wake Forest University Divinity School. She also served as executive director of the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life and general counsel of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Her areas of expertise include the First Amendment's religious clauses, religion in American public life, and the interplay of religion, policy, and politics. Additionally, she co-authored a casebook on religion and law from the Baylor University Press, The Religious Freedom and the Supreme Court. She holds a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School and a BA from Baylor University. Next, we have Aisha Khan, who's represented a party or a friend of the court in 35 U.S. Supreme Court cases, over 100 federal and state appeals, and scores of trial-level cases. Formerly a deputy chief in the appellate section of the Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Department of Justice, and the legal director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. She also has extensive managerial and supervisory experience in the litigation sphere. As a partner with the Potomac Law Group, she focuses on appellate litigation in state and federal courts around the country and partners with trial-level litigators to ensure that issues are fully and properly preserved and presented for appeal on behalf of commercial, municipal, and individual clients. She's admitted to practice in Maryland and the District of Columbia, every federal circuit, and the U.S. Supreme Court. She served her JD from UC Berkeley's Bolt Hall School of Law, go Bears, and her BA from the University of Michigan, go Blue. Tim Schultz is the president of the First Amendment Partnership and directs all aspects of the organization's work, building faith alliances, guiding public policy, and educating key influencers on religious freedom issues. Prior to First Amendment, he served as a state legislative director for the Ethics and Public Policy Center's American Religious Freedoms Program. In that role, he directed all of their state policy initiatives, including developing and guiding coalition efforts to establish bipartisan religious freedom caucuses in 30 state legislatures. Tim is viewed widely as a leading expert on religious freedom issues with a particular focus on state policy issues. Additionally, he is a former instructor at George Mason University, was a staffer in the DC office of Senator Bob Dole's presidential campaign, and he's a graduate of Kansas State University and the Georgetown University School of Law. Hoda Hawa is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at MPAC, the Muslim Public Affairs Council. She oversees MPAC's strategic initiatives and government and policy by engaging those circles at the highest levels and developing an active constituency around policy. She's written and spoken on subjects ranging from international religious freedom and national security to free expression and bullying. She's been featured on the BBC, Al Hura TV, Fox News, MSNBC, Voice of America, NPR, and C-SPAN. She also spoke at the first ever groundbreaking event at the White House, honoring and highlighting the contributions of American Muslim women during Women's History Month. She writes frequently on issues that affect Americans both domestic and internationally, with a particular emphasis on those issues that impact American Muslims. That has a BA in Poli-Sci from George Washington University with a concentration in international affairs and the Middle East, and a master's in ethics, peace, and global affairs, focusing on Islam, ethics, and conflict resolution from American University School of International Service. And then do I have Ariel's? And I will read Ariel's in a moment when I find it. But as I start out, each panelist will have a few minutes here to give them opening remarks, and what I've asked them also to add to this is thoughts around what do they see as the leading issue today in public policy, in excuse me, in public policy, in faith, in our civil discourse going on in the country today, and incorporate that into their opening remarks. So, actually, are we gonna go?
We were just trying to find Ariel's bio.
Perfect. It's on your website, probably, right?
I think everyone has seen it on the screen already as they were coming in. I know. There we go.
Ariel Geingold joined Ben the Ark in 2013. In her capacity as Deputy Washington Director, Ariel represents the organization on Capitol Hill to the administration and in diverse coalitions on issues ranging from voting rights to immigration reform to promoting LGBT equality. Prior to joining Ben the Ark, she served as the Deputy Director for Public Policy at the Interfaith Alliance, developing and executing advocacy strategies on all areas of the organization's work, protecting religious freedom. She also participated in the year-long Eisendarth Legislative Assistant Program at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. Born and raised in Jupiter, Florida, she graduated magna cum laude from the George Washington University with a BA in Poli-Sci. Thank you. And I'll welcome you to start.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you all today. It's been a hard, I was going to say couple of days or week, but it's been a hard while in our country. And in moments like that, it's good to be together with friends and allies from our big community. At the top of my mind right now when we talk about the pressing issues related to religion in our national discourse is white nationalism, and with it as well the ideology of the religious right. They're in some ways distinct, and in some ways they are in sync. I think we have some overlapping Venn diagrams here in these ideologies and in the policies that are put forward under the banner of these ideologies. I do not believe that it should be considered politicizing a tragedy to demand an end to the root causes of this violence. Though the perpetrator is solely responsible for his heinous actions in Pittsburgh this weekend, and same goes for the perpetrator of the violence in Kentucky, the political leaders that appeal to hate and fear and bigotry are also responsible for their actions and have blood on their hands, have our blood on their hands. These ideologies are toxic. White nationalism, which is espoused and given new life by President Trump, by the leaders of the Republican Party, have claimed the lives of 11 Jews in Pittsburgh this weekend and of Maurice and Vicky in Kentucky and countless others from countless other minority communities. This ideology fuels attacks against LGBTQ Americans, against immigrants, against refugees. It fuels the family separation policies that are tearing immigrant communities apart. And even after this tragedy, we are still seeing the president and his allies in the Republican Party promoting anti-Semitic tropes and dog whistles. I don't even know if we can call them dog whistles anymore. It's a pretty blatant anti-Semitism coming from our government's leadership, including most recently, as I believe it was yesterday, the National Republican Congressional Campaign Committee defended an anti-Semitic advertisement that they put out against Minnesota candidate Dan Feehan. They put this ad out about a week ago showing George Soros as the string puller, the puppet master behind Mr. Feehan's campaign and used that dog whistle attack to fuel their base. Bend the Arc Jewish Action called on the NRCC to take down that ad, and just yesterday they again defended that ad, even after the anti-Semitic attack in Pittsburgh this weekend. We know that it is not just Jews under attack from these ideologies, though, and far too often attacks on our community do get more media attention than attacks on other communities. We believe even more now than ever that the key to our collective safety is for those of us whose lives are threatened by white nationalism, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, people of color, LGBT people, to live in unity and solidarity. And this unity and solidarity is what is giving me hope right now. Before I even talked to my parents on Saturday, I had heard from Hoda, checking in to see how I was doing and how our community was doing. Bringing us back a bit more to our topic at hand today. There is an overlapping Venn diagram of ideology from white nationalist sentiment and the policies that are put forward by the religious right. These policies, and frankly, the way that leaders of the religious right pursue them, feel all too often like a subset of the American religious fabric is trying to have a monopoly on what it means to be a person of faith in America today. These policies, for some period of time in our history, had been on the fringes, trying to allow for pulpit politicking, defining the lines between religious freedom and civil rights and what it means to have those boundaries. They are now in the mainstream of the policies that are proposed by the Republican Party and by President Trump as the leader of this Republican Party. And I'm talking specifically about the anti-trans policies that President Trump had started to push last week and the far-reaching attempt to use religious freedom to discriminate. We firmly believe that religious freedom guarantees us the right to hold any belief that we choose, but from our community's perspective, it does not mean the right to harm others or discriminate against others. For Jews, we cannot stand by an attempt to discriminate and deny the rights of others in our country on the basis of religious freedom. And one of the arenas in which we're particularly concerned that this is playing out today is in the adoption and foster care space. You may have seen the news in the last week that the state of South Carolina has requested a waiver to a non-discrimination policy under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and there are 10 states that have passed conscience clause laws specifically in the adoption and foster care space, all wrapped up in whether a faith-based adoption provider is allowed to prefer their own individual religious beliefs over the best interests of the children who they are serving who are in the state's care. We are concerned by the implications for the best interests of children, and beyond that, we are concerned about the rights of a whole range of minority communities, not just the Jewish community, when we talk about the boundaries between religious freedom and civil rights and how to find that proper balance. We must address the root causes of this violence. We must call white nationalism, and we must call upon our president to denounce white nationalism. As Asma said, our leaders in Pittsburgh have put out a letter demanding that the president do not come to Pittsburgh until he meets these demands. And this is not just for the sake of the Jewish community. This is the sake for our Muslim, Sikh, LGBTQ, immigrant, and refugee brethren. And we will continue to fight these fights together because we do believe that it impacts all of us and we are stronger together. And we can do better to change the nature of religious discourse in America. Thanks.
Thank you.
Please.
I'm going to use the podium because I have so much to cover and I will talk faster if I am standing. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the intro. Thanks to SALDEF. Thanks to the museum for putting on this event. So I was happy when I got here because I saw a lot of different ages in the audience, and I wanted to ask people if they remember the original Saturday Night Live. Good. So there was this segment, the weekend update segment. Remember that? Well, they still have it. Nowhere near as good. Nothing about SNL is anywhere near as good. But back in the day, what I really liked was the commercials. I will get to the topic. Don't worry. And one of the commercials I remembered really well was a husband and a wife in a kitchen standing around a kitchen table. There's a spray can of white, creamy, foamy substance sitting on the table. And Gilda Radner over here is saying, "It's a floor wax." And her husband, Dan Aykroyd, is saying, "No, it's a dessert topping." And they're going back and forth, and then Chevy Chase rushes in and says, "Actually, it's both." And that's how I feel about the discussion of religion today. People come at this from such wildly different perspectives. So what to one person looks like, all I want is equal access to a commercial establishment, right? I'm an LGBT person and I want to be able to use a baker. And to someone else, it's banishing religious people from the business world. I mean, these are really diametrically opposed perspectives on the same kind of issue. And another thing you see is that in the religious display context, it's, to some people is, we're just upholding our national tradition. For other people, it's, you're forcing Christianity down my throat. And I think this different perspective has made it hard for us not only to find common ground, of course, but also to understand each other's perspective. And as a litigator, I also feel like the US Supreme Court's coming at this in so different, highly politicized, and often very inconsistent ways. And so I'm going to try to capture that really briefly, a very little time. I just wanted to cover 4 topics that I think will kind of capture where we stand today, and also give you a sense of how things have gone so back and forth over the years. There's religious exemptions, which we've already touched on with Masterpiece Cake Shop. And I imagine most people know, but the baker there was arguing that you're subjecting me to a public accommodation statute that requires me to essentially, in his mind, celebrate gay marriage by producing a cake for a wedding for an LGBT couple. And the court dodged the issue, basically. On the one hand, the court said, we can all agree that a clergy person could not be forced to officiate at a wedding, right? That's a free exercise interest. But we also agree that business owners generally can't refuse to comply with anti-discrimination statutes. But they didn't tell us where the line was to be drawn. Instead, they said everybody has a right to neutral and respectful consideration of their claims, and looked at some statements commissioners had made and said that didn't happen here. So sent it back down and left a lot of unanswered questions. And we see that not just with bakers, but we see that with florists and innkeepers and all these folks who are saying we don't want to serve the LGBT community. And we see wind back into their sails. They had, up to the time of Masterpiece, largely lost in the lower courts. And we'll have to see where that kind of plays out over time. The second issue I wanted to cover is religious displays. So historically, these are the crosses in the public parks, the 10 Commandments. Historically, if a display was obviously religious or was obviously erected with a public purpose, a religious purpose, it was unconstitutional. And so the court struck down, for example, a solitary creche in a public park, but let stand another creche that was accompanied by a candy cane and a reindeer and a Santa Claus and a Christmas tree, and all of a sudden that looks like it's sort of a more inclusive message. It's not an exclusively religious one. Likewise, 10 Commandments. Texas State Capitol Grounds puts the 10 Commandments with a bunch of other things. It's okay, but you put it by itself, you make some religious statements, not okay. Now, one of the interesting things, of course, we're all very focused on the Supreme Court changing over, is that Justice Kennedy was actually never met a religious display he didn't like, at least not in dicta. I mean, he basically, in terms of the bottom line, didn't have a problem with religious displays. And I imagine everybody does that Kavanaugh is going to land in very much the same place. But the big difference here is the Supreme Court hasn't taken a case in a very long time, a big religious display case. It now has a case that's been reconferenced 4 times. A big public cross here, actually in Bladensburg, Maryland, a granite public cross in a park. The Fourth Circuit struck it down, said it was impermissible, and we'll see what the court does. If they take it, the other side is arguing for a pretty big sea change in the law, so we could then see granite crosses all over the country, and they would basically be off limits to challenge. The third area I want to cover, religious funding. This is an area where the litigation has focused a lot over the years. The notion of the Establishment Clause has sort of formed around the notion of public dollars being put to religious use. And historically, the court said, you can set up funding programs, like vouchers is the most common one, where the money travels to religious institutions because I or anyone else made a private choice for that to happen. But if the government makes the choice, so for an example, grant programs, you can't give it to an institution that's pervasively religious or to an institution that's going to put it to religious use. Can anyone hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So that principle has eroded over the last 20 years, I'd say. And 2 terms ago, in a case called Trinity Lutheran versus Pauli, which is a little bit of a sleeper because it has to do with nonprofit entities getting getting money to purchase recycled tires to use on playgrounds to create cushions for kids. But basically what the court did is it sort of abolished what was the longstanding understanding that if you're a church, you basically can't get money through a public grant program. And now you can. But there was a footnote there leaving open what you can do with it. So could you, for example, put it to religious use if the government has an equal opportunity grant program? And we'll see that now playing out in the lower courts. And then the last issue I wanted to cover, I'm not too far off time, I can kind of slow down. The last issue I wanted to cover is public prayer. This one gets a lot of press. So it plays out principally in 2 areas. One is public schools. The court has said you cannot deliver a public prayer at a public school graduation. You can't at a public high school football game open the game with a prayer. And the interesting thing about that is Justice Kennedy was pivotal on the results in both of those cases. They said, you cannot do that. That violates the Constitution. And he's obviously now gone, and it's very unclear to me how solidly we can rely on that principle. The other area in which that's played out is legislative prayer, where government bodies, county councils, city councils open their meetings with prayer. And historically, the court had said it's okay as long as those presentations were ecumenical, non-sectarian, weren't focused on Jesus Christ, the resurrection, what have you, like highly charged Christian-specific commentary. If it lacked that, it was okay. And then in a case a few years ago now, I should know, I was lead counsel in the case, but lost it. But it was about if invited clergy come in from the outside to deliver the prayers, can they then present highly Christian messages and do so the majority of the time because we're in a community where there's virtually no non-Christians? And the court says, yes, that's fine, because the government shouldn't be telling people how to pray and because it was open to all, meaning even if there were no non-Christians who came, that's all right. It wasn't because of any discrimination. And now the lower courts are struggling with the fallout from that. What does that mean? What if it's the commissioners themselves doing the praying and they themselves are delivering Christian messages? Then can we have a different kind of standard? We've got a split in the circuits on that. The Supreme Court decided not to take it last term, but that's also very much percolating in the lower courts, and that's another area that's, I think, going to be front and center for us as these issues percolate up. So that's kind of a quick overview, and hopefully we can talk about some of that when we get to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Melissa Rogers. I'm glad to be here with you today. I want to thank SALDEF and the museum for organizing this important event. I'm glad that we have the time to talk to one another today. So it's very important. Ozma recounted the awful events of the past week, and I want to begin by expressing my sorrow and condolences to all the victims and the survivors. Precious lives have been lost. and people are experiencing great pain and suffering in our country. And we all got to do something about it. That's what I want to focus on in my remarks. To honor the dead and the survivors, as Osman noted, we have to reflect on who we are and where we are and what we can do to respond. And I want to focus on this issue and begin by focusing on the responsibility of a president and the responsibility of the president in national discourse. In the United States, we have one person who represents us all and who is charged with preserving, protecting, and defending the Constitution. This person's words are so influential that we call the post the bully pulpit. That person is the President of the United States. And with that post comes great power and great responsibility. Right now, we have a president who is willing to use factors like religion, race, nationality, and ethnicity, as well as violent language and imagery, in his attempts to defeat his opponents and silence his critics. That is wrong. It is grossly inappropriate to his office, and it is dangerous. On the campaign trail, Trump called for Muslims to be banned from this country. As president, Trump has never retracted nor apologized for this call. Instead, he has spread anti-Muslim propaganda. President Trump has said that some very fine people marched with the Nazis and the white supremacists in Charlottesville. At a White House event this summer, President Trump told a group of evangelicals that if the GOP loses the upcoming election, Democrats, and I quote, will overturn everything that we've done, and they'll do it quickly and violently. The November 6th election, he told the evangelicals, is a referendum on your religion. President Trump has also whipped up fears about refugees and immigrants, most recently highlighting the caravan of desperate people who are fleeing Honduras. Before the Pittsburgh attack, Trump repeatedly said that this will be an election of Kavanaugh, the caravan, law and order, and common sense. The Pittsburgh killer is an anti-Semite who hates immigrants and refugees. One of the killer's recent fixations appears to have been the people in the caravan from Honduras, and the fact that Jewish people have extended their compassion to immigrants and to refugees. Using factors like religion, race, and nationality and ethnicity to whip up fear and anger is wrong, and it is dangerous. President Trump has coupled this fear-mongering with a willingness to repeatedly use violent language and imagery, both on the campaign trail and in the White House. He has praised a congressman's assault on a reporter. He has called for his supporters to knock the crap out of protesters at rallies. He's told police officers that they shouldn't worry about roughness when they're arresting people. He has shared doctor videos that show him beating up a media outlet. Before the suspect was arrested in last week's attempted bombings, President Trump said it was, quote, very unfortunate that Americans were talking about, quote, bombs, putting it in quotes, which suggested it might be a hoax, that they were talking about that rather than the issues that he believes will help Republicans win elections. Using violent language and imagery is wrong, and it is dangerous. Indeed, such expression by government officials and politicians is never, ever acceptable. And that's why I also objected when Eric Holder said, when they go low, we kick them, even though Holder was speaking metaphorically. People do not necessarily understand that language is being used metaphorically. They don't necessarily listen to a whole speech or read a whole article. Some of them, particularly people on the edge, latch on to charged language and take it seriously, and it can incline people who are on the edge to act violently. Put simply, violent language can encourage people to act violently, especially people who are unstable and inclined toward violence. And this is one of the times in our history when using violent language is like tossing a lit match on dry kindling. It's unacceptable. Words matter. Leaders have influence, and none more than the President of the United States. Leaders need to exercise their influence responsibly. The use of violent language and fear-mongering on factors like religion has to stop, and it has to stop right now. I'd like to close with a story about another president, President George Washington. In August 1790, a leader of the Truro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, wrote a letter to President Washington saying, and I quote, "Deprived as we heretofore have been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the almighty disposers of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine." President Washington responded to this letter with a letter of his own. It's a very eloquent letter. I wish I had time to read the whole thing, but one of the things he was doing was agreeing with this expression by this Jewish citizen about the importance of religious liberty for all, not just tolerance given by one privileged group to another less privileged group, but religious liberty for all, and that the United States must indeed give to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance. This is the kind of leadership that we have to have restored in the White House. This is the kind of leadership that we have to have reflected throughout public service and in our citizenry generally. Such a restoration will require something of all of us. It is time for all people of goodwill to speak up and to take action. We have to draw a line in the sand, and we have to make those whom we have elected toe that line now. Lives are at stake. America has often been a place where citizens have changed the trajectory of our country by calling on the nation to heed the better angels of our nature, as President Lincoln so memorably said. The United States, I am confident, can be such a place again if we commit to making it so. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for being here today. I want to thank SALDEF for putting on this panel, ESMA and the Museum for really hosting this incredibly important and timely conversation and for including me. I too want to also express my deepest condolences and sympathy to the Tree of Life Synagogue Jewish community in Pittsburgh and to Jewish communities all around the country. And Ariel, reaching out to you on Saturday was not out of the ordinary, because I remember on June 26th when we were going to the Supreme Court to hear the decision about Trump's Muslim ban, you were there with me, and you've been a partner to us and an ally, so thank you very much for that. The regularity, I think, and the increase of these hate-motivated crimes that we've been witnessing over the last now almost 2 years, and especially what we saw on Saturday, it's not happening in a vacuum. We've heard from Ariel, from Aisha, from Melissa, that words matter, rhetoric matters, perceptions matter, and perceptions play a role in policymaking and the way that we as American citizens deal with each other, treat each other, and build and establish those relationships with each other. We have to be honest. We have to be clear about the divisive rhetoric from elected officials that creates and enables an environment like this to exist. And in fact, for the last 3 years now, a lot of our communities that are represented on this stage have witnessed an increase in hate crimes, in hate incidents, in hateful rhetoric, not just from our fellow American citizens, but really, and I think the most disgusting of all, from our elected officials who do use the power of their bully pulpit to galvanize their supporters and their communities to not only continue that rhetoric, but to take it a step further. And that's what we saw on Saturday, and it's what we saw over the last week. So I want to talk about the social and political environment that we do find ourselves in today. A 2017 Pew Research poll found that 50%, half of Americans, say that Islam is not a part of mainstream American society. 50%. The perception that Islam and Muslims are a new and a foreign community to this country only serves to reinforce the notion that we are an other. And in fact, about 30% of slaves that were forced to come here through the slave trade were Muslims. Muslims have been in and have fought in every single American war, including the American Revolutionary War. We have been citizens in building this country, in being productive neighbors and teachers and doctors and lawyers. And yet again, 50% of Americans think that we are not, and that the religion, Islam, is not a part of American mainstream. Yet both perceptions and policies continue to otherize American Muslims. Now take, for example, the annual White House Ramadan Iftar. The first year that President Trump was in office, in 2017, he decided to cancel that tradition of hosting the breaking of the fast, the dinner, during the holy month of Ramadan. Now, you may think that that's a pretty benign cancellation of a dinner at the White House, but this is a slow erosion of tradition that presidents have upheld and have kept at the White House. This is a tradition that started with President Thomas Jefferson. This year, Trump decided to host the White House Iftar, but only included ambassadors and foreign diplomats coming from Muslim-majority countries. The erasure of American Muslims from this tradition and this almost stubborn reliance on leaders from Muslim-majority countries seeks to further marginalize American Muslims from being considered part of the mainstream, despite the contributions from our communities to the nation's pluralism, wealth, and productivity. Other not-so-subtle policies, yet still highly malignant, include, and we've heard already, the Muslim ban. As a candidate, Trump talked about banning Muslims, and as president, he implemented it. He uses his Twitter account to retweet British far-right and ultra-nationalist groups that post anti-Muslim videos. He stacks his administration with officials who proudly and publicly align themselves with known anti-Muslim bigots and known anti-Muslim organizations that seek to further use their power of the bully pulpit to create and implement policies that negatively impact not just American Muslims, because we all know at this point that an attack on one community is really an attack on us all. So these policies are ineffective, they're counterproductive, and they're downright anti-American. So those are the policies part of the policies and perceptions equation. Now let's talk about media and perceptions. Again, a recent Pew polling found that 53% of Americans think coverage of Islam and Muslims by news organizations, American news organizations, is generally unfair. In the entertainment industry, by and large, we're still seeing depictions of Muslims as what I like to call the 3 Bs. We're either bombers, we're billionaires, or we're belly dancers. And then if we're not those 3 Bs, then we're depicted as either the victims of hate crimes or we're the perpetrators of violence. And there's a lot of work that's being done, but a lot of work that still needs to be done. In fact, at our organization, MPAC, we have a Hollywood bureau in our Los Angeles office that works to promote accurate portrayals and representations of Islam and Muslims. And this is work that is so desperately needed because we continue to see these depictions of Muslims and Islam be so negative and really just are incredibly inaccurate. And I want to conclude with just this last number and this last thought. About 50% of Americans report that they themselves personally know a Muslim. And those 50% of Americans generally tend to have more favorable views of Islam and Muslims when they know one personally. Now, imagine being in media, imagine being in the entertainment industry, imagine being a policymaker or a government official and not knowing a Muslim. And you're tasked with telling stories or creating policies for communities that you don't know anything about. You don't know their challenges, and more importantly, you don't understand their opportunities. And I'm not saying that this is the case for everyone, But it's incredibly problematic that, again, going back to that number, only 50% of Americans can say that they personally know a Muslim. And this is why that all of us do the work that we do, especially in the advocacy space. I think it's so incredibly important to continue to build those bridges, to be in communities, and to get to have our fellow Americans understand us, understand our challenges, and understand our opportunities, and that we're really having the same dinner table conversations that every other American family is having. And we work to ensure that these accurate representations of Islam and Muslims are out there so that the policies reflect the actual realities of our communities. American Muslims are the most diverse faith community in America. African Americans comprise the biggest community of the larger American Muslim community, and Latino Muslims are the fastest growing. So we as American Muslims already look like what America is slated to look like in 2040. We are just waiting for those perceptions and for those policies to catch up to where we as a community are. I am incredibly humbled, and I'm so privileged to be working in this space, to have built relationships with our allies, with the partners, with the panelists here today. And I look forward to the conversations that we have today, and I look forward to getting to know all of you throughout the rest of the event. So thank you.
So I first want to thank SALDEF, my neighbors at 1730 M Street, and the museum and OSMA for hosting this gathering, and just say what a privilege it is to be here with my fellow panelists who are all extremely distinguished. I also want to share with what the other panelists have said about the grievous evil that took place this weekend at the Tree of Life Synagogue. I'm a lawyer, kind of policy person, and sometimes people like me overly focus on government policy as the core of religious freedom, but there's something even more core in that, is that's the right to worship without being afraid of violence. And there can really be no more grave violation of human rights and religious freedom than what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue this weekend. So I share in my condemnation of the evil act, but also the rhetoric that I think Melissa's right is giving kindling to these kinds of evil acts by people that are kind of on the margins and sometimes react to this kind of rhetoric. I do, though, want to talk from my experience as someone who works on behalf of religious liberty of all faiths and has done so in over 30 legislatures in the last 7 years, to kind of just frame what I think is a proper view of religious freedom and mistakes that are made frequently, in my opinion, on both the left and the right, and the mistakes are different. And I want to talk about that through a couple of religious freedom incidents that have occurred about 25 years apart. The first of those incidents is that just over 25 years ago, President Bill Clinton stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, surrounded by a beautiful multi-faith coalition, and signed something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA. And I think there are people here in this room who worked on that law, actually. And it's a great law, and it has protected a lot of religious free exercise. And I think it was a great moment that law passed almost unanimously in the United States Congress. I think there were only 3 dissenting votes. Just last week, a little bit lost in all the darkness that happened in last week, there was actually a good religious freedom story that came out of all places, Oklahoma. In my opinion, the most conservative state in the union. And there was a high school student in Oklahoma who wanted to wear ceremonial eagle feathers as part of the high school graduation ceremonies. These eagle feathers have great religious significance to the student. And of course, as happens frequently in these cases, the school did not want to make an accommodation for the student's free exercise of religion. Well, the school changed its mind after the Oklahoma Attorney General pointed the school district to the fact that Oklahoma has a state Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And after looking at the law, the school district backed down, and the student will be marching at his graduation wearing these religiously significant eagle feathers, and I think that's a great victory for religious freedom, actually, that avoided litigation, and I think justice was served. Now, why do I use these 2 stories? Well, having been around the country and worked with hundreds of lawmakers of both parties, from very conservative to quite progressive. I want to sort of say something good and something bad that I see in the perspectives of each. And again, these are generalizations, but I think they generally hold true. On the conservative side, more conservative lawmakers, generally when I tell them that I am there and I work for an organization supporting religious freedom, that's usually welcomed. Hey, religious freedom, we're for that. That's great. And so I call that laudatory. On the downside, sometimes, not a majority of the time, but sometimes these lawmakers will, once they're comfortable enough with me, say something like, I'm not sure that religious freedom really ought to protect everyone. Like, do we really think it should protect Muslims, for instance? I've had that happen on about a dozen occasions. Just last week, in a state gubernatorial debate, the governor of South Carolina, who is a Republican, said in public forum that really constitutional protection of religious freedom was intended for folks from the Judeo-Christian tradition and not really any others, right? He was proud to say that. I think that is a problem, okay? So there's some good, but there's also some bad, okay? Now let's take a look at the progressive side. And I think that the issues are kind of flipped. On the progressive side, I have generally seen a laudatory impulse to protect the religious freedom of religious minorities, Sikhs, Muslims, Jewish Americans, Native Americans. That has been a lot of most progressives would laud what happened in Oklahoma, religious minority, even though it was a Republican Attorney General who enforced that law, I think also in a laudatory way. But religious freedom for religious minorities is a good thing. I think that if I were to critique the progressive view, it is a suspicion that all religious freedom claims made by so-called more powerful or more numerous religions are problematic by virtue of who is making the claim. So for instance, one can look broadly at the Catholic faith and say it's big, it's powerful, it's wealthy globally, it's influential. However, when you're up against the mighty arm of the government, when the government is threatening to fine you, the Little Sisters of the Poor, faced off against the federal government, that's an uneven matchup. And I think that progressives would do better to take seriously those religious freedom claims, even from those whose religious freedom claims they disagree with. President Clinton said something when he signed RFRA in 1993 that I think still should hold true today, and I think actually kind of needs the question, what is the most important issue? This is what I think it is. President Clinton said this. He said, government ought to have a really good reason before it interferes with anyone's free exercise of religion. That doesn't mean we never do it. It just means government ought to have a really good reason. And not only that, but we ought to feel really bad when we're forced to interfere with somebody's free exercise of religion. And I think that's really the open question. I think it's the most important question. Are we going to protect free exercise for everybody, even for people with whom we religiously disagree? Are we going to strain to try to find common ground and to find accommodation that will work? Or are we going to say, no, I don't like you, you're making religious freedom claims that I find morally repulsive, and I don't even care, I'm going to trample your religious freedom. And the reason that I worry about that point of view is that I think that everybody is going to be left with an impoverished state of religious freedom. We're all going to have less of it if we have the view. So it's either we're going to have a lot of religious freedom or we're going to have a little religious freedom based on the level of accommodation we're willing to give to people with whom we disagree.
Okay. So a reminder to folks here in the room, as well as those of you following us online, please submit a question if you have any. We have a series of questions for folks throughout the panel here, but we would love feedback from those of you here in the audience. If you are online and wanting to submit a question, please tweet at us at SALDEF. That's at SALDEF as in Frank, and we will try to get your question read as well. So with that, let me start off with an easy question for the group. Aisha, you talked about, I think earlier, kind of recent Supreme Court cases, and then the masterpiece and the travel ban.
how are Americans talking about these cases? What's the impact of these cases to our broader public life and the implication for people of faith?
Well, you know, as a litigator, I sort of am in court most of the time, talking to judges and talking to clients. And it's in that very kind of highly polarized kind of context. So what I think about is, you know, Tim mentioning, and I think this is a legitimate point, that, you know, if you're going to take an extreme position that doesn't take seriously the perspective of a person who feels that they are being forced to violate their religion, I think the problem really comes up when you've got clashes, right? And so that's great in the abstract, but when it is in contrast to the LGBT person who wants to frequent that establishment, I think you get back into that framework that I was trying to allude to, that it becomes one or the other. And there's no simple way to work your way through that. You know, there really isn't. I think part of the problem is these are really, really tough questions. And one of the things I think about is, and I don't have an answer, and I really would be interested in throwing this open to the panel and perhaps to folks in the audience, is that, you know, one of the criticisms of the Democrats in the 2016 election was that they ignored the concerns of white blue-collar workers, mostly men, right? And that what they needed to do was to take seriously those concerns. Am I hearing kind of seeing nodding heads? Like, this was a very prevalent criticism. It remains one going into the next one. And here we are talking about the Republicans with Trump at the top whipping up white nationalists right into a frenzy against, pick it, LGBT community, black people, refugees, Jews, whatever, pick it. But the problem is this is speaking to Republicans, right? We're not seeing, sorry, I'm being partisan here, but we're not seeing the numbers change. And I think, what's the analog for what we do to take seriously what underlies the traction that this message is getting? So that's, just throw that back out there as kind of a question.
Sure, Tim.
Well, I mean, I think we have to do what we've done is to condemn rhetoric that you know, that is violent and is dehumanizing. And I think that's where I agree with Melissa. There's a lot of it. The one thing I would depart is, I think clearly the president has a unique bully pulpit. The president has a bigger Twitter following and bigger influence than probably just about any other American. One of, you know, in our celebrity age, there may be a few celebrities that have more influence, but not many. But I actually think that this is this is something not confined just to the president. This is not to do a kind of, you know, kind of whataboutism, right? It's just to say that that kind of rhetoric is quite common across the political spectrum. The othering of the kind of tribalism is really common, and I think we have to ask ourselves how we get our own houses in order, how we police our own, you know, our own allies, how much we're willing to call out those who are perceived as being our ideological allies. I appreciate Melissa sort of saying, "Hey, Eric Holder, do better." You know, this doesn't mean we need to say Eric Holder is, you know, terrible. It's just do better, Eric Holder. You know, and I think that people need to be more willing to say of their perceived ideological comrades that you're wrong. This is over the line.
Right. I would agree, and I think it's very important that we have consistent standards in all kinds of ways, both on religious liberty and on this rhetoric issue. And I think anybody, especially a person in a position of public trust, who is fear-mongering on the basis of faith and other factors, and we can go down the list, has to be called out. And anybody who is using violent imagery or violent rhetoric has to be called out. And that's why, you know, I certainly have called out President Trump and said Eric Holder was wrong when he used that metaphor that he did. So I think we definitely have to be consistent about these things and condemn them wherever we find them. I also stand by the fact, though, that the president is the president of the United States and has special responsibilities.
And I think one of the challenges in this present moment, and taking a step back, I want to thank you all for your words of support. I think, Melissa, your comments and your remarks were right on, and I think that's part of the challenge, is that we are talking about an issue that should not be partisan and is. Bringing it back to the Muslim ban, if you compare where we have been at different points in our history under President George W. Bush, who I could quibble and argue with a lot of his policies, but that was a different Republican president than President Trump is. And so we are dealing with partisanship where we should not be. We don't have Republican leaders calling out Islamophobia and calling out anti-Semitism in the magnitude that I think we perhaps once did. And that is fueling this. It's hard to reach the voters that Aisha, you spoke of, when they're not going to listen to a progressive Jewish organization in the same way that they would listen to the leader of their party.
Well, you compare how George W. Bush handled 9/11
Exactly.
with how Trump handled Charlottesville.
Yeah.
And
I
it's,
see it.
sorry, thank you. It's not just rhetoric, I think. I think that, yes, absolutely, your remarks were spot on, Melissa. Rhetoric needs to be condemned, and it needs to be condemned by everyone. And I think when we're talking about President Trump, absolutely, it needs to be condemned by the people in his party. The second step to that, which is incredibly dangerous, and we're seeing more and more of, is that the rhetoric is not only trickling down to the average person who is already inclined to hate or not like a certain community, and so we see those violent acts happening, but we're also seeing it at the policy level, that policies are being implemented now, not just by the president when he writes his, has his executive orders, but when members of his party are then getting in line and voting for those policies or ensuring that those policies end up being implemented so that they are effectively the law of the land. And so going back to your question about, the Masterpiece Cake Shop Supreme Court decision versus the Muslim ban, as American Muslims, and I obviously don't speak for every single American Muslim, but we were incredibly demoralized by the Muslim ban decision, obviously. And we saw that there was, at the highest level of the land, that there is a difference with how religions are viewed and the protections of religious liberty. And I will say, for the record, that the Muslim Public Affairs Council, we did sign onto an amicus brief in support of the couple in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, because we saw that if a couple, an LGBTQ couple, was going to be discriminated against using a religious argument, that it could happen to any community.
Yeah.
And so we were absolutely in support of them. But so how do you deal with a country that's being run, that's viewing religions differently? And when you're talking about Islam, typically when we're talking policies in Islam, it's being securitized, right? We're seeing the religion through a national security lens, and so policies can, be written. They can have a negative impact on this community, and it doesn't matter because in the name of national security, we have to carry out X, Y, and Z, and eventually you have a Muslim ban.
So, a lot of, I think, troubling statements from across, right? And a lot of work we still have left to do. I'm interested in, there was a study in 2007 by the First Amendment Center that said 65% of the populace in their poll believed that the Constitution was written with Judeo-Christian values, and then 50% of that actually believed that it was ingrained or physically written in the Constitution. So I think a huge gap of understanding to, I think, Melissa and Aisha, your point about how words matter, although to about politics, I think part of this also is actions matter too. I think back to the tragic shooting in Oak Creek in 2012, and to Ariel, I really appreciate your comments around what gets visible kind of news coverage or what gets called out by our politicians. And I think of that as, interestingly, Paul Ryan was very vocal. Obviously, that's his home district. And President Obama stood up for it. But on the same token, Had that happened, the community's feeling at least, had that happened to any other community, wouldn't the president have shown up? Yet, Attorney General Holder showed up, and I have a lot of respect for him. On the same token, the person who runs the bully pulpit, right, Melissa, from your comment, didn't show up for the community. And I think similar instances we've seen in whether they're shooting for our Muslim brothers and sisters or African American brothers and sisters. Where is that? I think there's that action piece also of leaders standing up for what they feel, but also standing up for what is right. And how do we implore them to do that? Okay, so the next question I would pose is, so you talked about, you've all mentioned public policy here a little bit. What are opportunities for examples for how you feel public policy can be appropriately or positively impacted by diversity? And then what's the balance there that needs to get played? I'll start maybe with Melissa, and then.
Sure, and just, Oak Creek was such a tragedy, and I was thinking about the roster of houses of worship before coming here that have been attacked just in the recent history, and it made me feel sick. Condolences to everyone who has lived through the tragedies, and of course, our condolences to the family of those who have not. And, I know one of the things, President Obama wanted us always to do was to find every opportunity that we could to build more and recognize more diversity in the country. And unfortunately, when you're in that position, you can't always do everything that you wish to do. But one of the things I was very proud of is having your colleague, Manjit Singh, named to the Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships under President Obama, and also celebrations of Sikh holidays. And I'm probably going to not get this pronunciation right, but the Guru Nanak celebration that we had at the White House every year. So we were very grateful. And I was very pleased to go with my colleague, and then my colleague later, Cecilia Munoz, to Gurdwaras to mark various holidays. So that was important to us, and we were, of course, sent by the president to do so. On policies, I think both Tim and Aisha have really done a good job of starting to get us thinking about the complexity and the issues especially about religious exemptions from generally applicable laws. And when there is an interest in particular, like reproductive rights or LGBT rights on the other side, these, as we know, are just terribly combustible and difficult issues. And, I think of my friend Richard Fulton, who often says we're too dismissive of the various sides of these debates instead of actually listening to one another. And sometimes, and it can happen on the left-hand side, we can err by being selective in our approach to religious freedom, by not taking seriously claims when they involve LGBT rights and reproductive rights. And on the right, there can be an insensitivity to religious freedom when the interest on the other side, when the interest of the religious freedom person is like, I want to make sure I can make my house of worship a sanctuary for immigrants. And so we see this selectivity that's happening, and we need to work on that because the standards should be consistent, not based on whatever policy prerogative that I'm trying to further here. And I think these conversations, I think we've not done a great job of having these conversations in public, because some of the slogans that happen around these issues, like the do no harm slogan, it's more complicated than that, right? Sometimes we allow a Baptist church to hire a pastor and not a rabbi, because that's what we do for churches. And yes, that harms the rabbi who isn't hired by the Baptist church, but that makes sense because we want to let churches be able to define themselves. So there's harm that happens there, but it's harm that we say is not cognizable under law. And then, but then on the other side, I think, sometimes we have freedom to serve or fairness for all slogans. And sometimes those slogans don't recognize, in the freedoms to serve, for example, instance, is it freedom to serve, or is it freedom to get a government grant or contract to serve, which makes a difference? And in the fairness for all, yes, there should be fairness for all. We all agree on that. But what about treating LGBT rights, for example, differently than every other protected category in civil rights laws, like race or gender or religion? That's significant. As lawyers and policy, people involved in policy, we know that's significant. How do we explain treating LGBT differently, meaning giving wholesale religious exemptions from LGBT non-discrimination protections for people that have religious freedom concerns when we don't give religious freedom exemptions from laws that would be protecting people on the basis of race or gender or nationality. That is a real rub. That is a real issue that I think we have to grapple with, and I don't see that issue being joined very effectively. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done.
So, the phrase fairness for all is sometimes used for policies that attempt to find a both-and solution to religious rights and LGBT rights. And of course, there was one state, Utah, that did sort of famously strike that balance and pass along. President Obama at the time praised that law as a model of kind of figuring out how to solve these issues. But I agree. I think that we would not want to treat LGBT rights as differently than every other protected class. Also, though, I think the insistence that LGBT rights be treated exactly like race has issues also that are somewhat that make it somewhat tricky. So I think that there are, at least on those issues, which I'm quite familiar with, some hard thinking and middle ground that can be struck. And I think we could do a whole talk about this, and probably should not. But I think that there are reasonable ways of accommodating one another on those issues that can be reached. And actually, as someone who deals with state lawmakers who are far less interested, and state lawmakers of both parties, who are far less interested on sort of academic theory and more focused on living with neighbors and sort of practical solutions, I find that the willingness to find common ground on those issues, even those very tough cultural issues, LGBT rights, religious rights, there's a lot of common ground among left and right on the willingness to do that. And I think that sometimes they find that the reason they're not able to reach consensus is more they sort of reach consensus among themselves, and the national groups on, again, the left and the right sort of come in and say, no, you're doing it all wrong, and we're going to attack you if you do this and pull your funding. I actually think that solutions are at offer if we would just kind of let people negotiate in good faith on some of these things.
Well, just to jump in, I think part of the problem is you have to really get into the details, right? So when you think about adoptive agencies, foster care, religious institutions in the mix, public funding, those are a lot of variables, right? So it requires getting into the weeds to figure out how do we accommodate both sides of this. And we, as a country, are getting so monosyllabic. I mean, you go on, you've got to have an extreme perspective, all these media outlets, you've got Fox News that's gone one way, you've got MSNBC that's gone another way, and everybody's preaching to the choir, short attention spans in the country. I think, we've seen that, like studies are showing in terms of younger kids, and it's just getting to be that people and politicians are the worst. I mean, this is why I've done some lobbying. I honestly hate it. It's like the worst thing you can ever do, because these politicians, they don't want to talk details. They just don't. And I feel like these issues are hard and they're tough, and you need to take seriously both sides. And that means the solution to that is an incredibly detailed solution. It's not just all in or all out.
I think it is definitely hard, and getting into the weeds of things and sorting out those details is incredibly difficult. I will say, though, so that I'm not like the only person who's all doom and gloom all the time, is that I am previously. I think there was some sort of allergy on the part of politicians to be working with faith communities and leaders to include them in the policymaking decisions and having those conversations to really try to get to those details. Over the last even few years, I would say that I do see more and more faith-based advocacy organizations. I see a lot more faith leaders coming to the table, being invited to the table to represent their communities, to represent their views and their needs, to be part of those discussions. And I think as long as we continue to have this whole of society approach to policymaking, then we're on the right track. But I hope that we don't go back to that sort of allergy of just, DC just talks amongst itself and forgets about the rest of the country. I think where we're at right now is forcing us to consider all these different communities and all these different players.
Yeah, I think one of the things that worries me is, I think, Tim, you're right that we need to not paint with such broad brush strokes on either side. One of the things that I think does happen, and I wish didn't as much, is that I think too often when we start criticizing the argument being espoused on either side, it then becomes seen as not taking seriously the sincerely held religious beliefs of people making these, bringing these cases, like the Little Sisters of the Poor. I have no doubt that they are sincere in their religious beliefs. My quibbles, my criticism is with the lines that they are putting forward between religious freedom and access to healthcare. And so I think as we are working on not speaking so to the news cycle, as Aisha said, to the short attention spans, I think we also need to be very clear about what we are criticizing, what debate we're having. And I don't think that the debate is on whether someone is sincere in their beliefs. I think sometimes it is, but I think more often than not, it's about the policies and the nitty-gritty details that we need to get into. I do also want to circle back to what you said about Oak Creek. I think especially in the last year with the rise in attacks on all different kinds of minority communities, really over the last few years, the Jewish community in particular has been doing some overdue work checking our own white privilege. Jews are majority white and present as white, but we also know that 10 to 30% of our community identify as Jews of color. And Jews are LGBT, Jews are women, refugees, immigrants, et cetera. But we do have also a form of privilege. And I think part of how we ensure that the individuals in Kentucky are not forgotten, that the community of Oak Creek is not forgotten, is by each of us using our collective privilege where we have it. And also, I think, one of the things that Huda and I have found in our work together is that, we don't think that it's weird for MPAC and Ben the Arc, Jews and Muslims to be calling out anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, but that's still not that common, I think, in the broader public. And so I think that these kinds of partnerships and conversations is how we not just ensure that the victims of these tragedies are remembered, but how we address the root causes and prevent future atrocities.
Yeah, I think as I look back to kind of the start of my advocacy, and maybe some of you on the panel as well, of post 9/11, and how that changed our world, was really a very watershed moment for many of us in the Mensa communities. I remember that day and that week, the first calls I got were from, to your point about solidarity and partnership across communities, the first calls I got at SALDEF were from our colleagues at the JCL. And so Floyd Morey, among others, called and said, what can we do? We've gone through this and we can see where this path may lead. And it took a little while, right, till we got to the Muslim ban, but they saw where the road was headed and what can we do for you? And then I think very clearly as well, with our Muslim brothers and sisters, I was around the Berkeley campus at the time, and I think there were beautiful things that were happening at a local level. We had something where Muslim brothers, Sikh brothers would basically stage hourly walking from the library or from different buildings back to the dorms so that we could be there with each other and for our Muslim and Sikh sisters, just to ensure that, hey, look, let's show solidarity amongst ourselves here. And so I appreciate that comment. I wanted to go back, and I know, Aisha, you talked about this in your opening, and so we can touch on this again. I think a big issue that we've obviously all been inundated with the past several months was the hearings with Justice Kavanaugh. What are your feelings about that? I know you talked about it really quickly, but how do you think this is going to impact the national discussion on religion? Right? I think everybody is, whether rightfully or not, is freaking out. I think is the technical textbook term there. So what's the reality that we'll see there? And so I'll start that with you, Tim. I'd love your thoughts there, and then Melissa, I think as well, as a scholar and as somebody that's worked in government, I love your thinking from that perspective.
So my principal concern is I think the U.S. Supreme Court has lost its institutional kind of legitimacy. And I think since Bush v. Gore, we have just been in like a total slippery slope down. And I think it just hit the gutter. And I think it puts a real challenge on the court. You know, you've got a Justice Roberts leading it, who's obviously very concerned about the sort of institutional legitimacy of the court. Where does it sit? Is it really immune from the legislative process? And I just think I'm almost speechless on where we go from here. You know, if the Democrats take the House, there may be impeachment proceedings, there will be new investigations. You just saw Swetnick and Avenatti referred to the FBI. All of a sudden, you know, they care about investigations. So it's, I don't know. I mean, I really am kind of speechless about where we stand as a country in terms of looking at the Supreme Court as a place that's slightly immune. It's always been a political body, but I think it's just gotten worse and worse to the point that we can't look at it any longer as an institution that's sort of a stopgap on that disintegration.
Well, I don't have so pessimistic a view. You know, I certainly have my disagreements with various decisions that the court has made, including with the decision in Hawaii versus Trump, which Hoda mentioned. But you know, I think that I'm going to wait and see what this new court does. I do think that Chief Justice Roberts, as Aisha mentioned, has a very deep and abiding concern with the institutional integrity of the court. And there are ways in which he can, and others on the court, can be good stewards of the court's reputation in terms of the cases that they take. Justice, that's one way they can govern this issue. They may not decide to take some cases in order to keep the country more together and to keep the court more together. They may decide cases very narrowly. I know Justice Roberts often says that if an issue is not necessary to decide a case, it is necessary not to decide that issue. And going more narrowly may be a way that the court can also be a better steward of its institutional integrity. And of course, it falls to the justices themselves to reach out to one another. So at this point in time, I'm going to say that the jury is out and to watch this new court very carefully.
And I would just say that on the issues that I know most about, which are the issues related to free exercise or Establishment Clause, I just would note that the court in some of these high-profile decisions has actually been had kind of a consensus opinion, right? Aisha, in the cases that you mentioned, Masterpiece Cake Shop, that was a 7-2 decision. The Trinity Lutheran case was a 7-2 decision. Little Sisters of the Poor case, that was a unanimous decision.
But they largely avoided the issues in all of those.
Well, they avoided the issues, but the government's ultimately the position the government was taking, the court unanimously sort of forced them to retreat, right?
It wasn't a decision on the merits. They said this is not a comment in the Little Sisters case. This is not a comment on the merits. They said go try to see if you can find a way to work this out.
Right, but I would argue, fair enough. But I would argue that there was an attempt. The outcome of the case was the Little Sisters got what they wanted. Right? They got an accommodation. Right.
The immediate outcome, and I don't want to litigate the Little Sisters per se, but just talking about what the court did is they sent them back to try to work this out. What I think we found is that the court was more optimistic about the ability to work this out than was actually merited. And so then, then it was thrown into a holding pattern, and then the new administration took over, and now we are in a different place.
The Hosanna Tabor case, which was about the rights of religious entities to hire whom they wanted, that was a unanimous case. There was a lot of sturm and drang about that at the time, but it was unanimous. So, I mean, again, I don't know if I'm in general optimistic about the court or not. I would just say that one thing the court has been doing is most of these religious cases sounding in religion and therefore generate a lot of heat in the commentary, right, that Aisha talked about, a lot of heat on the left and right. The way the court's actually deciding these cases is in a kind of consensus way, and I think that's good, actually.
So one of the things that's really interesting about the free exercise clause is that for a long time, there was an interest in basically gutting it, okay? It was a very well-known case called Employment Division. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the bottom line is if who you are is a Native American ingesting peyote, the free exercise clause not only doesn't apply to you, but basically doesn't exist. And the Supreme Court took that case as an opportunity to say the free exercise clause means you're out of luck if there's a neutral statute, basically. And then when you turn it around and the people who are advocating their free exercise interests are instead somebody like the baker in Masterpiece Cake Shop, all of a sudden what we have is the free exercise clause making a big resurgence. That's what we're seeing right now, is the free exercise clause has really been flipped on its head. So all of a sudden it's on steroids. And one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting for this court is if we can start to see minority religions. We've seen a little bit of this. There was a case with a very long name that involved the use of ayahuasca, which is a less known something on one of the DEA's very high prosecution list. And the court said, and I think Roberts wrote, that they were entitled to an exemption under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So you see a little bit of it, but there's been a real resurgence of the free exercise clause, and I'm interested to see how that plays out.
But if I may take slight issue with you on this, which I hate to do, but the case that really, the sort of background free exercise case, this idea of animus toward a particular religious group kind of causing that group to win, the leading case on that.
Who to win?
Huh?
Causing who to win? Sorry,
The religious claimant, the person claiming a free exercise claim, is a case called City of Lukumi, which is a case involving the Santeria religion in Florida, a case litigated by my friend, probably a friend of some of yours, Professor Doug Laycock, who is a religious freedom expert, scholar. That case was about singling out a particular religion for disfavor. I mean, I think that was in the background of the court's decision in Masterpiece. And that was a religious minority, and it was a unanimous decision, again. So
that was not an exemption.
Well, it wasn't an exemption,
like
but it was
targeting of a particular religious entity for a particular outcome. It was not whether you are entitled to a new exemption from a neutral setup, which is what.
But ultimately, it was an animus
Yes,
rationale,
exactly.
and that, and again, the rationale of the 7 justices in Masterpiece was an animus rationale, right? Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of evidence on the record of animus. I mean, that's why you had Kagan and Breyer voting for Jack Phillips, which I don't know that their political sympathies lie with him, but there was a lot of evidence on the record of animus in that case.
Not a lot of animus, actually. There were 2 commissioners who said, and I'm really going to read you what they said, because I think when you stack it up against the travel ban, I think you actually see quite different outcomes there. Yes. So one commissioner said that Phillips, the baker, can believe, I'm quoting, what he wants to believe. He can't act on his religious beliefs if he decides to do business in the state. Another one said, religion has been used to justify all kinds of discrimination throughout history. Honestly, I don't see those as all those hateful anywhere near the equivalent of what President Trump did, which is to call for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. And so I think these are apples and oranges, and not only did they came out in opposite ways. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that's the problem here.
Mm-hmm. Well, and actually, Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer, if memory serves, were on within the 7 in Masterpiece, and also thinking that Hawaii versus Trump should have come out the other way. Yeah. So they showed one way to thread this needle, which is to say that the evidence of lack of neutrality in the Masterpiece case was objectionable. So was, and indeed in greater measure, the animus displayed in the Hawaii versus Trump case. So there are ways to, to recognize on both sides. And I think earlier Ariel was talking about, we don't often find that people are insincere. And I think that was part of what the concern was of the majority of the court in Masterpiece, that there was a presumption of insincerity on behalf of the claimants, and that we should never presume. We should never presume that people are insincere in the expression of their religious faith. If there's obvious evidence that they are insincere, then we should call that as we see it. But we shouldn't presume that there's something. We shouldn't presume that they are insincere, and we should never say that their religion is wrong or that they have to change their religion. What we should do is neutrally apply laws to their circumstance and say, you either meet the standards or you do not of the legal standards, but not to say that a religion or a religious belief is wrong or presume that there's insincerity on behalf of the claimant.
Well, and what really bothered me about the travel ban case is that their rationale was, we have to consider not only the statements of the particular president, this was the way they brushed it off, but we need to consider the authority of the presidency itself. But the presidency itself didn't adopt the travel ban. It was this particular president. And so I think part of the problem with the court is that you got to have real reasons too. You can't just be making it up. And that kind of a rationale really reads like you're just making it up for an outcome-driven result.
Okay. Some decent energy on that question, so I thank you all for that. Let's turn to a question from the audience. Can a policy to bake a cake for a gay wedding also mean a requirement to bake a cake for an anti-gay or anti-Muslim individual? I imagine is the question.
Absolutely. I mean, who knows? I mean, we don't know where we're going to land on Masterpiece, right? I mean, that's still waits to be seen, but I think it would have to be an equal opportunity kind of arrangement, except this gets really complicated, right? I mean, you can disagree with someone's ideology and you can disagree with their status. And so in Masterpiece, there was no doubt that you could refuse to bake a cake that had a particular message about an issue on it. But what you couldn't do is refuse to bake a cake for a person on the basis of their status. And so those are sort of two different things, and I think they're kind of embedded in your question. You'd have to really tease it out, which was at play.
That's right.
But the other thing I think about is the whole Masterpiece issue can really show up in so many different contexts. So, you've got a baker who doesn't agree with interracial marriage, doesn't want to bake that cake, or you've got a baker who thinks Muslims are heathens and so doesn't want to bake a cake for an Eid celebration. I mean, it's one of those things with a lot of legs, and I think it can become very hard to draw the line, and it does, in my opinion, consequently become quite appealing to draw the line in the realm of, that in the business world, you kind of live with equal anti-discrimination principles and can't pick and choose who you want to serve.
Thank you. Tim, a question for you. Can we take free exercise claims seriously and still find in some instances that those claims will fail?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, look, it's what Bill Clinton said that I come back to. You have to have a really good reason before you interfere with someone's free exercise of religion. I think it's noteworthy that many claims brought under things like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act or the Free Exercise Clause, a lot of those claims fail, and they should fail, okay? Many people over the years have claimed when they are arrested for abusing their children, have claimed a right to not spare the rod, right, and a kind of religious claim. Well, religious freedom doesn't give you the right to commit violence. It just doesn't give you that right. The right of the state to protect citizens overrides your right to free exercise. There are lots of other types of analogous situations, some of them involving bad faith claims of drug use. People in prison, if you read the free exercise claims coming out of prison, a lot of them are good and deserve to be protected because actually people's religious freedom in prison is violated all the time. But some of these lawsuits are shall we say, creative. The Church of the Chateaubriand requiring you to have wine and steak at every meal.
Hey, don't criticize
Hey,
my religion.
Exactly. I mean, a little bit of a creative claim. So yeah, just like free speech, right? Free speech is not absolute. It's a weighty right. It's a First Amendment right. It doesn't mean that every single free speech claim wins. And I think the same is true of free exercise.
Thank you, Tim.
I think we'll get agreement with this on this. Or we get
Oh,
just
absolutely.
amen across the board. All right.
And referring to RFRA as a nonpartisan statute, I mean, it really was. I think people didn't quite realize how it would be used. And I think that's been what's led to a lot of the problems.
So I have 2 questions left. The first, and I'll open it to the panel, whoever feels best equipped. Melissa, you talked about, I think, the great work President Obama did in his administration in reaching out to multiple faith communities and diverse communities around policy issues. And like you mentioned, our former chair sat on that commission, and I felt as an organization, as a community, we were more engaged with the administration, and I imagine similarly, MPAC would probably feel a similar vein. I think that is in contrast to probably what we are seeing now. I have gotten, I don't know, a handful of requests, at least in the last year and a half around, and basically it's the same reporter checking with us, or the same a couple institutions checking. Hey, has the president reached out to the Sikh community? Hey, has the president reached out to the Muslim community? And generally our answer is, not so much. So the question I guess I would have for you all is, in a time then, I can't remember who spoke to it, about, I think it was, although you started it, and maybe Ariel as well, you'd mentioned about how do we, as faith-based communities, or people of faith, how do they engage in advocacy then, and in voicing their concerns, and in trying to work with government when there is, to the panel's points, sometimes there's that allergy to engaging with faith community, or sometimes there's this hesitancy period of an administration reaching out. What are tactics, or what are things that these communities should be doing?
Well, I think there's another question that we often get to add to your list there, which is, but we believe in the separation of church and state, so why should we as Jews be saying that we want X because we're Jews? I think the bottom line is that, for our community, as I'm a lobbyist for our community, when we advocate to our elected officials about what we believe in, and for these things, it is grounded in our Jewish values. Where we come from is that that's where we're sitting. And we have good secular reasons for wanting XYZ policy too, for thinking that families should not be separated or indefinitely detained. There is a good secular reason for that. It also is paired with our Jewish values. And I think at the end of the day, our elected officials represent all of us. And so they need to know where we're coming from these issues. And I think that bringing those values with us shows the diversity of opinion and the diversity of ways in which we arrive at asking for the same thing. I think that there is a shift in the openness of elected officials to hear from all different kinds of communities. I think that too many are not as open to hearing from the Muslim community as they need to be. And that's where we sit as Jews in a different position of privilege. And I think we need to just name that. And so I think that there has been and continues to be a lot of work that we do together. I lobby just as much in coalition as I do as an individual, because we know that together we make better, stronger arguments. I think a lot of this happens on the local level too, and needs to keep happening on the local level. Ben the Arc is doing a lot of work around the election right now. But we didn't just start doing that work around the election. Our local leaders have been building relationships with their elected officials. And so I think we are doing this and need to continue doing this work both in Washington, where the legislators live, a couple days a week, and also back at home in districts, connecting them to real people who are coming at these issues from a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Melissa. No, go ahead. So we've definitely had to make some tactical shifts. I think when this administration came in, we too have not received any, if at all, attention
Well,
from.
you're banned too.
Yes, and we're banned. Yes, from this administration. And I'll go back to the point that I made in my opening remarks about this administration in particular, really relying on government leaders of Muslim-majority countries as if they speak on behalf of and for American Muslims, which they absolutely do not. I would argue that American Muslims are by and large the most independent Muslims. We are the most diverse. We have diversity in thought, diversity of backgrounds and experiences, and we say ourselves, we have an independence, we have a unique American Muslim identity, and yet this administration continues to rely on really dictators and autocrats to speak on our behalf. So in terms of our advocacy work, yes, we have had to make some tactical shifts. We do rely more on our allies on Capitol Hill, for example, of which there are a lot. And we do rely on them using the power of their bully pulpit and their leadership for speaking out against divisive rhetoric or pushing for positive policies. We rely on our coalition partners and allies. They're absolutely incredibly important and very necessary to our work because, when we're talking about an issue like the Muslim ban, for example, it's not always the most convincing of arguments when you just have a bunch of Muslims around the table saying that this is a policy that is un-American, right? When we come in with the diversity of strength in those coalitions, then it speaks louder to our policymakers. I will also say that when it comes to faith-based advocacy, yes, I do see that allergy sort of decreasing. We're getting better at that. And we have no shame in saying that the values of our faith drive our policy positions. And yes, that's why we're fighting for a Clean Dream Act. That's why we're fighting to overturn the zero tolerance policy that separates families and children at the border, that we're fighting for economic and human security. And I will say that I think the most inspiring work that I've seen really is at the state and local level, where we see these diverse coalitions coming together to fight for policies like sanctuary policies, coming together to work on campaigns like the Poor People's Campaign. And so my hope is that as we continue to try to find an effective way to resist against some of these policies that are hurting our nation and the values that we espouse to have, that we see a lot more of these movements coming from local communities and it trickling up so that the grassroots are going up to the grass tops and then we see it eventually at the national level.
Just a quick comment. I think, absolutely that religious people have just as much right to speak out on public policy issues as do secular people, secular communities. So, and of course, the administration I worked in, we were reaching out to labor and business and civil rights, and, religion has to be a part of that. Religious people have voices, they have values, they care, they need to be at the table, and I think it's the obligation of every administration to reach out to every people of all different faiths and none, and that is on the administration. That is the administration's responsibility. I will also say that in my time in the White House, one thing I try to do other than that, in addition to that, I should say, is reach out to, in particular, faith groups that I knew that were conservative theologically or politically, because it was very important for me to reach out and hear from them as well. And they might not have approached me. So I wanted to make sure that they knew that the door was open, that we wanted to work with them, we wanted to hear from them. I ran the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. I said to them, you know what? I know we can find one or more partnerships that we will agree on. and we'll just have to find it, and then we'll go from there. And I had a lot of people work with me quietly behind the scenes, some more publicly, but that is the job of serving the people of the United States of America.
The other thing to throw out there in terms of diversity is the non-believing community. I think that's not represented so much up here, but it's really a growing force. I think it's 30% now are identifying as non-religious. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how that community, sort of changes the dialogue as it grows and gets more vocal. It's something I think we're seeing now. I work a lot with nonprofit civil rights organizations that I work for, have me on retainer to help them with their litigation. And one of the cases I'm helping on is one brought by a secular fellow who runs something called the Freedom from Religion Foundation, who wants to deliver the opening prayer in the U.S. Congress. Because 40% of the prayers, those are opened with a prayer by a chaplain who's an employee, but 40% of those prayers are opened by a guest chaplain. And that has included mostly Christian people, but a very small number of non-Christians, sometimes with ugly results. I mean, they managed to get their prayer out, but there's protest and such. But they turned down the request from him because he's non-theistic. And so it's going to be interesting to see. That was just argued in the DC Circuit, and it looks like they might win. So that'll be a really interesting issue to percolate up too.
I should say that the Secular Humanist and the Secular Coalition of America were a very active part of the President's Community and Interfaith Service Campus Challenge program, which involves college students in reaching out to one another of different faiths and beliefs and serving their neighbor. And so they were a very important part of that coalition, and so I was glad to have their participation.
And the American Humanist is the lead plaintiff in the Cross case, the Bladensburg case I mentioned. That's currently been reconferenced 4 times by the Supreme Court and may very well be heard this term.
Well, I want to thank the panel. I know we are over time. I want to end with, and you are channeling me perfectly. We're over time, so I'll ask you all to be maybe 30 seconds, a minute. What are you hopeful about? Right, look, we've talked a lot today about some of the struggles, the obstacles, the challenges that we have in front of us, and you were all selected also because I think none of you are afraid of a fight and understand what we need to do as individuals, as the organizations you represent, and as a country. But what are you hopeful for or about?
Start with me.
Tim, I'll start with you.
We were talking about this backstage before we all came out, and we were comparing anti-Islamic animus in the United States to Europe, where it's also quite pungent. And, we actually have had better protections for religious free exercise for all faiths in the United States than we have seen in Europe. Analogous, countries, rich Western democracies. So I'm hopeful that despite a lot of the animus that we see in the culture and a lot of the rhetoric that we've all condemned up here, that the laws protecting free exercise of religion are still pretty good in the United States relative to our counterparts in other Western democracies.
I would say that I am hopeful about the determination of Americans to correct the wrongs that we see. And whether that is opening their doors to their American Muslim neighbors or their Sikh neighbors, I'm really hopeful in the idea that we as Americans truly value the principles and ideals that this country was founded on, and that we all aspire to see the country be and live out those values. And so it's the resiliency, it's the determination, I think, that we all have as Americans that I'm most hopeful about.
I'm hopeful about, especially after this awful week, hearing people speak up and take action in new ways that they haven't before. Also, our past and our history of people standing up, protesting, taking action, and changing the trajectory of our nation gives me great hope. And also, just finally, this beautiful exchange that Ariel and Hoda had when Ariel mentioned that Hoda had called her even before her parents got to her this weekend. That gives me hope.
Mine would be for a national leader who can speak to both sides of this divide and really take it seriously in a way that unites us rather than continues to engage in the "you're wrong, you're right" polarizing presentation.
In addition to the partnerships that I think are represented on this stage and in this room in general, I have drawn hope from the fact that more than 30,000 people in like 10 hours signed on to the solidarity statement, signing on in solidarity to the message that was written by the Bend the Arc chapter in Pittsburgh. I am also drawing hope from the record numbers of people who are registering to vote and who are engaging in early voting. And from the diversity of people who are running for office on all the way down the ballot. I think that is where we will we're already starting to. I think that is where we will see the changes that we need to and that we want to in our country, in both the rhetoric and in the policy.
Thank you. One thing, and we didn't talk too much about the candidacy of new folks running for political office, right? I think that's something I'm really hopeful for, that we see whether it's a Sikh woman running for the state Senate in Washington, a Muslim American woman running for the United States Congress in Minnesota, or a Sikh serving as the Attorney General here in New Jersey. We're seeing communities engage, right? And whatever side of to your point, the divide that they're on, communities are beginning to engage and beginning to make their voices heard. So I'm hopeful that will lead us to this more perfect union we all look for. With that, I want to thank everyone on this panel. Thank you for taking out your time, for being here, for the passion and the work that you're doing, and also for the way that you engaged, right? There were disagreements, friendly primarily, and how you set an example, I think, for everybody here, everybody watching at home, of how we can engage on things. And we can disagree substantively, but how do we actually try to make the other person hear us in a way that is not "you're right and I'm wrong"? So I appreciate that, and I thank you all. To those of you here in the audience and at home, thank you so much for joining us. If you're interested in this work, if you're interested in the messages you've had here, please check out the organizations that are represented. Support organizations like those represented here, like the Freedom Forum Center at the museum, like SALDEF, MPAC, the First Amendment Center, Bend the Arc. These organizations are doing great work. They can benefit from your support in a variety of different ways. So with that, I thank you all, and I look forward to our next conversation.